Góðan daginn, Árni Finnsson heiti ég, vinn fyrir Náttúruverndarsamtök Íslands og með mér eru félagar mínir frá Clean Arctic Alliance og ICCT, Brian Comer, Sverrir Konradsson hjá hvað heitir þetta, Sverrir?
Samgöngustofu.
Samgöngustofa. The Icelandic Transport Authority will take care of running the meeting for us. He has worked at the IMO for many years and he is familiar with these issues from the security point of view. So I'll soon give over to him. We will listen to Pam Pearson and from the International Climate Initiative. We will listen to Kåre Press Christensen from Greenland, Green Transition Denmark, sorry, and we will listen to Brian Comer from the International Council of Clean Transportation, and then I will finish the session, and then we have questions and answers. Say over to you, Sverrir.
Thank you, Arne. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar Confronting the Arctic Climate Crisis, What Arctic Countries and the Shipping Industry Can Do, organized by the Clean Arctic Alliance and the Iceland Nature Conservation Association. This seminar is in fact prompted by the Arctic Council Ministerial meeting, which will be held in Iceland in May. As you may know, Iceland has held the chairmanship of the Arctic Council since May 2019. Iceland's theme for the two-year presidency has been Together Towards a Sustainable Arctic. The theme reflects Iceland's commitment to the principle of sustainable development and refers to the necessity of close cooperation between the states and peoples of the region and beyond. With sustainable development as an overarching theme, Iceland has highlighted 4 priorities: the Arctic marine environment, climate and green energy solutions, people and communities of the Arctic, and a stronger Arctic Council. Data from the Arctic Council's PAIM working group has recently highlighted the increased number of fishing vessels in the Arctic. The safety of fishing vessels and their crews is of course of utmost importance, especially in the unique environmental and hazardous navigational conditions of the Arctic. For your information, Iceland, Spain, and the IMO, International Maritime Organization, have proposed a project in the PAIM working group recognizing the importance of fishing vessel safety in the Arctic due to this increased traffic there. The project is an effort to raise awareness in the Arctic Council of the provisions of the 2012 Cape Town Agreement for the safety of fishing vessels and the experience gained in the implementation process by Arctic states and other nations. Although not yet enforced, the agreement is a key IMO treaty to address fishing vessel safety and thus environmental protection. It includes mandatory international requirements for stability and associated seaworthiness, machinery and electrical installations, life-saving appliances, communications equipment, and fire protection, as well as fishing vessel construction. The agreement will improve the safety of life at sea for hundreds of thousands of fishers worldwide, including in polar waters, as well as having other benefits such as environmental protection by the operation of safe fishing vessels on the world oceans. I'm looking forward to an interesting and informing webinar today. The presentations will undoubtedly spur some fruitful questions and answers in the end. We have some housekeeping things to attend to. First, a couple of housekeeping matters. Please note the information on this slide, and in particular, the webinar will be recorded and made available afterwards. And secondly, if you have a question, could you please submit it via the Zoom Q&A option, which should be near the bottom of your screen, and if possible, indicate to which speaker the question is directed. We will endeavor to answer all questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but if time runs out on us, we will endeavor to follow up with a response after the event. The purpose of today's webinar is to highlight the climate crisis in the Arctic, the impacts of changes being experienced in recent months, and what the Arctic governments and the shipping sector can contribute to tackle the Arctic climate crisis. The Arctic is undergoing an acceleration in dramatic and unprecedented change, warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. In light of the latest changes, it now seems possible, if not likely, that the summer sea ice cover across the Arctic will have disappeared before countries achieve climate neutrality. There is an urgent need for collective action, and the shipping industry is just one sector that must take responsibility for this contribution. In my opinion, maritime safety is a key to environmental protection from pollution by ships. A safe and well-operated ship is a fundamental prerequisite in order to protect the environment from pollution from vessels. Today's presentations will explore what is happening in the Arctic, the role of international shipping, and how the shipping industry can become actors of positive change for the Arctic region. We have 4 speakers today, and then we will come to the Q&A and discussion session. We will move straight from the one speaker to the next with brief introduction. However, you can submit questions at any time, but they won't be answered till the final session of the webinar. Our first speaker today will be Pam Pearson, co-chair of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Agricultural Initiative and director of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. Over to you, Pam.
Thank you very much, Sverrir. So I should be sharing my screen right now.
Yes.
And I appreciate the chance to talk about the impact of Arctic shipping and black carbon. This is going to be a gallop through the impacts of black carbon and why we should care specifically about black carbon emissions from the Arctic. Quickly on black carbon, you'll hear more about its health impacts later. I'm focusing on the climate impacts. It arises from incomplete or poor combustion. It can come from everything from kerosene lanterns and cook stoves in the developing world to oil and gas flaring, which is another important source for the Arctic. These are extremely small, extremely dark particles, and they're very lightweight. So if they're lofted into the high atmosphere, for example, from wildfires, which is something that we work on in the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, they can travel very great distances. However, more often, black carbon actually deposits very close to the source, and that's a really important aspect when it comes to shipping. It also generally warms when airborne, but the warming impact is much more definite and sure in the scientific community when it occurs over snow and ice. But the most important warming and most intense occurs when it deposits on snow and ice. And you see that in this figure where in the global average, the warming impact from black carbon is much less than it is in the Arctic once it deposits on either ice or snow. That's the big black band to the right. And so it's very much greater. And the reason shipping is so important is because it is occurring, and increasingly so, close to the ice pack, very close to Greenland. You see this projection on the right-hand side of increased shipping, very much follows the shipping lanes. I do want to give a bit of a shout out to ozone emissions from shipping as well. That's on the left. They also have a warming impact. So it's sort of a double whammy when it comes to shipping impacts, specifically within the Arctic. And here is really the crux of the matter and why in-Arctic shipping is so important. because we often hear, those of us who work on black carbon, well, there's so much more emissions going on globally. Why is within Arctic shipping, which is so much smaller, so important? And this is the reason why, because the impact from global shipping, which you see on the left, both current and projected, is very small because very little of that black carbon actually reaches the Arctic or deposits on ice and snow. If it's already so high up in the atmosphere as to reach the Arctic, it's probably going to pass right over. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see the radiative forcing, the impact from within Arctic shipping is just so much greater. And so that's why this is such an important source. It's close to the ice, it deposits on the ice or on the snow, and that is why it really needs to be a focus in IMO and in other forums such as the Arctic Council. Why do we care? Well, as Ferdir said earlier, the Arctic is warming much more quickly than the rest of the world. We broke records all over the Arctic. In Fahrenheit, 100 degrees was breached for the very first time last summer. And as he also mentioned, we're losing Arctic sea ice, and this has a lot of impacts. We're already losing it today because of greenhouse gases, as well as black carbon. You can see where we are today, but the most important thing is that once we hit about 1.7 degrees, projections are that we're going to have ice-free periods almost every summer. But right now, with current climate commitments, we're actually on track for a minimum overshoot of about 2.7 degrees many months of the year then ice-free. And actually with current emissions, we're on target for over 4 degrees, and that will increase things even further. On the left here, then you see the projections with different emissions. This is modeling that's been done for the 6th assessment report of the IPCC that's going to be coming out in around August. And here you see this reflected where, of course, we've had this great decrease in sea ice ever since the 1960s in September. But if emissions continue, and especially if they're high emissions, up on the top, you see even in March, which is the maximum of Arctic sea ice, that begins to go down as well. So again, why should we care so much, especially about Arctic sea ice? And this is one of the reasons. It really is its own ecosystem. It used to be very, very thick, and it formed the base of the Arctic ecosystem and for really important fisheries, such as lobster and cod, but most of that very old sea ice, 4 years old and more, which used to be a significant portion really of Arctic sea ice every year, is now basically gone. We have much younger ice. Most of the ice in the Arctic now is 1 year old or less, and this is an essential change in the Arctic ecosystem structure. And the kinds of species that are important in the Arctic are not only under threat from the loss of multi-year sea ice, but the Arctic Ocean is growing warmer. It's growing fresher also because of loss of glaciers, loss of the Greenland ice sheet, and it's also undergoing acidification. So all of these things put Arctic species under stress, and some of these are really important fisheries, including, of course, for Iceland. Permafrost thaw and loss is another really important feedback from loss of ice in the Arctic. It's very strongly associated with loss of Arctic sea ice, and we're already seeing losses today. But the important thing, other than infrastructure damage, is that the emissions from permafrost already today are equal to about the size of Japan. So this is a major emitter, and that decreases our carbon budget, our ability to stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees C. So that's an important feedback. And finally, when it comes to Greenland, there's sort of a triple threat there where Greenland melt is increasing because of the increased emissions from permafrost, which leads to more global warming. The sea ice loss feedback also warms Greenland, warms the ocean around Greenland, as well as the ice sheet itself. And then BC has a direct impact on the ice sheet. And if we lose the entire ice sheet, we're looking at ultimately 6 meters of sea level rise. That loss of Greenland is projected to increase exponentially if we go above 2 degrees. So these are many of the Arctic feedbacks associated with loss of snow and ice, and therefore with black carbon. Two that I didn't mention are changes in ocean currents, as well as disturbance of mid-latitude weather patterns. And all of these are observed or in progress already at today's temperature, and they will simply get worse. So here are some of the groups that are working on Arctic black carbon. And the bottom line I want to lead you with is that halting black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping, it's not going to solve the problem of loss of ice or Arctic warming feedbacks, but Arctic ice is already on the edge and every effort is needed to decrease the pressure and the associated risks. And black carbon really does have an impact. Just yesterday, there was a study out in the Himalayas that showed that the decrease in black carbon emissions due to COVID increased the amount of water that was available in Himalayan watersheds by about 30% last year. So it may seem like a small impact, but it actually is very great. And it's something that's going to be important going forward. Thank you so much for your attention.
Should I just take the floor?
Thank you, Pam, for your very interesting presentation. Our second speaker today is Kåre Press Christiansen, Senior Advisor of Air Quality and Climate with Green Transition, Denmark. You have the floor, Kåre.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this interesting webinar. First, when we talk black carbon and health, or air pollution and health, it's very important to realize the full consequences. According to the World Health Organization, around 8 million people die every year due to air pollution. About 4.2 million of these deaths are related. It shows on my screen as you make it. Okay, I hope this is working. But first, 4.2 million of these deaths are related to outdoor air pollution and 3.8 million related to indoor air pollution. And you might think that this is mainly a challenge for developing countries. It isn't. In the European Union, around 400,000 people die prematurely every year due to outdoor air pollution. If we compare air pollution to the other risk factors, it kills a little more than tobacco smoking on a global level. If we compare to really heavy disease burdens of the developing countries, it kills around double as many as AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis altogether. And comparing it to risk factors we all fear, war, terrorism, and murder, it kills around 16 times as many people. And of course, compared to Corona or COVID-19 that have killed around 2.5 million deaths in 2020, it's still much higher. Much more people still die from air pollution, and that's every year. COVID-19 is 2 years, it will really affect something. If we look upon black carbon or black carbon particles, as Pam presented, it is important to realize that 90% of air pollution deaths are caused by particulate matter or particles. Particles, they enter the human body through the airway system. If we inhale it through the nose, air pollution can enter the brain directly, or it can go deeply through the lungs when we inhale it and enter the finest parts of the lungs, especially the smallest particles. They can enter the alveoli, cause inflammation, and be transferred to the blood, and thereby reach all parts of the human body. And especially black carbon is a dangerous cocktail of two important properties. Black carbon is created in combustion processes, and the surface of black carbon is thereby coated with polyaromatic hydrocarbons and heavy metals. So it has toxic properties, and at the same time, the black carbon particles are very small, and thereby they can reach the finest parts of the lungs, be transferred to the blood, and thereby reach all sensitive parts of the human organism. When we talk health effects, we know that black carbon increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases and thereby premature death, serious airway diseases like asthma, bronchitis, and smoker lungs, as well among non-smokers. Black carbon is level 1 carcinogenic, so it's carcinogenic on the same level as tobacco smoking and asbestos. And then there are many chronic diseases we can link directly to air pollution with black carbon. In Denmark, we did a cost-benefit analysis of a HFO ban with a focus on Greenland. The total cost of the HFO ban would be around $6 million per year due to increased fuel prices. But just the air quality benefits due to less morbidity and mortality were around $10 million per year. And then on top of that, we have the other benefits like climate benefits and oil spill benefits. And this means that the Arctic HFO ban is a very favorable investment for Greenland and the climate and nature. Money comes almost double as many times back. This impact assessment was submitted by Denmark for PPR 7 at the IMO. And just some pictures from Reykjavik, where we measured black carbon on behalf of the Clean Arctic Alliance 2 years ago. The picture to the left is the concentration of ultrafine particles, clear indicator of black carbon if you're close to combustion sources. And we see that upwind ships, we are around 400 to 500 particles per cubic centimeter. And when we go downwind the ships, we are up around 500 times more. And there are no other pollution sources between these two measurements. If we compare it to the exhaust of a heavy-duty vessels, here we made occupational health studies back in 2015 in Denmark, we have emission levels below 1,000 directly in the source of heavy-duty vessels already 6 years ago, because they have efficient particulate filters. There are no filters at ships. And then I will end my presentation by showing a movie from air quality measurements in Reykjavik, at least if this works. Let's see. I think this. I think you see it now. This is what we all talk about. These are from air quality measurements in Nuuk in Greenland, a cruise ship, done the main engines. And these huge amount of black carbons are emitted very close to the ice, as Pam explained. And of course, we'll have a high share of deposition on the ice. The solution is simple. It's cleaner fuels and particulate filters, like we have it for heavy-duty vessels. Thank you very much. That was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Kari. Very, very interesting. I'm happy that I stopped smoking 37 years ago. So, well, that problem is out of the picture for me, at least. We will be moving straight to our third presentation from Dr. Brian Comer, who is the Marine Program Lead with the International Council on Clean Transportation. Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Severe. And today I'll discuss Arctic black carbon emissions from ships, including patterns, trends, and policy options. I'll begin by explaining recent trends in black carbon emissions from ships in the Arctic and globally. I'll then describe the impact of IMO's Arctic heavy fuel oil ban on black carbon emissions. Then I'll describe the emissions reduction potential of switching from residual fuels like heavy fuel oil to distillates, what Cor just left off with. And I'll explain the additional benefits of switching to distillates and end with some conclusions. Black carbon is not only a climate pollutant, as Pam noted, and it's also a health hazard, as Cor just mentioned. The solid particles that ships emit, which include black carbon, are estimated to cause more than 6,000 premature deaths each year in the Arctic front, which is the area above 40 degrees north latitude. My group, the ICCT, estimates that ships emitted 1,450 tons of black carbon above 59 degrees north latitude in 2015. And you can see the pattern of black carbon emissions on the map, showing higher emissions in the Baltic and North Seas, but also around southwest Greenland, as well as Iceland, Svalbard, and the coasts of Russia and the United States, and even some emissions in the Northwest Passage. About 200 tons of black carbon was emitted inside the blue line, which is the IMO's definition of the Arctic, which excludes Iceland. Unfortunately, black carbon emissions have increased in recent years. The left panel shows how much black carbon was emitted in IMO's definition of the Arctic from HFO-fueled ships. It shows a 72% increase between 2015 and 2019. The middle panel shows black carbon emitted from all fuels, including HFO, distillates, and LNG, and it shows that total black carbon emissions in the IMO Arctic grew 85% between 2015 and 2019. Compare that to the global increase in black carbon emissions from ships, which was about 8%. So this means that black carbon emissions from ships increased 10 times faster in the Arctic than in the rest of the world. You may have heard that the IMO is banning HFO in the Arctic, and in theory, this should reduce black carbon emissions because using distillate fuels results in fewer black carbon emissions than using heavy fuel oil. But the ban, which begins more than 3 years from now, in July 2024, only applies in the IMO's definition of the Arctic, so it would exclude Icelandic waters. Ships built after August 2010 are exempt for 5 years after that, and Russia, the United States, Canada, Norway, and Denmark can grant 5-year waivers to their ships in their waters, even including in their EEZs. So the full impact of the ban doesn't even begin until July 2029. This slide shows a map of 2019 Arctic HFO use on the left, and on the right, it shows how much heavy fuel oil would remain under the ban if it were implemented in 2019. As you can see, there's hardly any reduction in the amount of heavy fuel oil used in the Arctic thanks to the exemptions and waivers. In fact, due to the exemptions and waivers, the HFO ban will allow 3/4 of the HFO-fueled fleet to continue to use heavy fuel oil. And as a consequence, we found that the policy will only reduce HFO carriage by 30%, will lower HFO use by only 16%, and will decrease black carbon emissions by just 5%. One immediate way to reduce black carbon emissions, as Cor mentioned, is for ships that use residual fuels like HFO to switch to distillates. And according to our research, if the Arctic ships that use heavy fuel oil switch to distillate, their fleet-wide black carbon emissions would be reduced by 44%. And because some ships in the Arctic are already using distillates, switching the HFO-fueled fleet to distillates reduces total black carbon emissions in the IMO Arctic by 30%. There's additional benefits of switching to distillates. The first is that using distillates reduces air pollution, including sulfur oxides and particulate matter. Second, distillates allow for the possibility of using exhaust gas after-treatment technologies, such as the diesel particulate filters that Cor mentioned, but also electrostatic precipitators, both of which reduce black carbon emissions by more than 90%. Lastly, using distillates eliminates the risk of an HFO spill, and it lowers the potential spill costs. ICCT's estimated that distillate spills are 30% less costly than very low sulfur fuel oil spills and 70% less costly than high sulfur heavy fuel oil spills. To conclude, black carbon is a climate pollutant and a health hazard. Black carbon emissions from ships are growing globally, but even more rapidly, 10 times faster in the Arctic. Switching from HFO to distillates would immediately reduce black carbon emissions from ships. The black carbon emitted from HFO-fueled ships that are in the Arctic would fall 44%, reducing Arctic-wide ship black carbon emissions by 30%. And switching to distillates has the added benefits of lower air pollution enabling the use of particulate filters and other after treatment technologies and lowering potential spill costs compared to the other fuels. So thank you for your attention, and back to Severe.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very interesting. I was the thing you said about the Icelandic waters are outside the polar coat delimitation line. Therefore, we are excluded from the Iceland is excluded from the ban 2024. I will talk a little bit about that towards the end. And thank you very much, Brian. Our final speaker today is Árni Finnsson from the Iceland Nature Conservation Association. Árni will be saying a few words on efforts and progress to combat the effects of Arctic climate change, and in doing so, will open the Q&A session. Please remember to send any questions via the Q&A option, and if you can indicate who the question is directed to, it will help us. Thank you. Árni, the floor is yours. You're muted, Árni.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Loud and clear, Árni.
Yes. The Arctic nations, all 8 of them, have one common fora to deal with issues like black carbon. And they have been adopting resolutions in the last 10 years or so. The first in Tromsø, 2009, in which they note the role of short-lived climate forces, which usually means methane or black carbon, and recognize that those issues have a potential to slow the rate of warming in the Arctic and urge implementation of early actions. They also welcome in Nuuk Declaration 2011 in Greenland, reports on short-lived climate forces, and they decide to establish a short-lived climate forces task force. And then in 2013, they agree on reduction of short-lived climate forces and so on and so forth. And they point out that if by banning or stopping pollution of black carbon, they will slow down the warming of the Arctic. And I remember specifically John Kerry, who is now the Czar of Climate, called Joe Biden. He particularly pointed out that the fastest way to slow warming in the Arctic and the world is to ban black carbon or the heavy fuel oil. And then again in Canada, 2015, strong language in terms of the resolutions, but again, Fairbanks Declaration, Alaska 2017. And at last, they underscore the important role of industry. And then the Arctic Council has taken action and can take action now in Reykjavik, where the ministers meet in May, 17 to 18 May, here in Reykjavik for the ministerial of the Arctic countries. And they can agree in a resolution to commit to action in 2021. They can develop a new commitment to decrease and ultimately eliminate black carbon from shipping, and they can commit to cooperate within the IMO for a ban on HFO in the Arctic. And I would like to mention at the end that the Icelandic Parliament, a committee of the Parliament, has published a report on the Arctic and Iceland's role in the Arctic, which is to serve as a background for a resolution by the Parliament. And they particularly note that heavy fuel oil is a special concern in the Arctic, that heavy fuel oil emits black carbon, which accelerates melting of ice and glaciers. And they also say it's important that the Arctic Council member states act jointly for proposal actions to reduce and ultimately ban the burning of HFO in the Arctic. So we have hope that Iceland will take the lead at the Arctic Ministerial here in Reykjavik in May. Thank you.
Thank you, Árni. And now all the 4 speakers have showed their presentations, and I guess that there are many questions that have popped into your mind, and so Sian, could you help me a little bit with the question, starting the question and answers session now?
Yes, I suggest you take the question from Maurizio. Brian has responded in writing, so it's in the answered column, but perhaps we could ask the panelists. Maurizio asked, what will be the role of hydrocarbon to decarbonize shipping in the Arctic? What are the drivers for hydrogen for shipping in the Arctic, and what are the barriers? Thank you.
Okay. Was the question directed to a specific speaker?
Brian, would you like to respond as you've written a response?
Yeah, I've responded with a link to a case study that the ICCT published a couple of years ago, and we looked at 5 Arctic shipping routes with different kinds of ships, cruise ships, bulk carriers, LNG tanker, a couple other ones. And we tried to figure out if you could, instead of using conventional fuels like heavy fuel oil, could you replace it with hydrogen, liquid hydrogen in this case, or use batteries or some other technologies. And we found that hydrogen is technically and theoretically possible to be used given the space and energy constraints of the types of ships that operate in the Arctic. There's also likely a role for batteries and electricity. Battery technology is even better now than we assumed in that paper. So it's even better. So I think that the main barriers right now are like everything with international shipping, including Arctic shipping, is the cost of fuel. We've seen that even when the cost differential between 2 marine fuels is quite low, like it usually is between 0.5% very low sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil, even when VLSFO is, even when MGO is only a few percentage points more expensive than VLSFO, ships are still fueling with VLSFO. And so only if the economics make sense will ships start using new fuels and ships being built to use those new fuels, or if there's a clear regulatory mandate. And so if we have clear regulations that require the shift to these cleaner fuels, that's a more guaranteed way to actually get this transition to occur.
Thank you, Brian, for this. I have one question to Pam, perhaps, if I may. She talked about the permafrost, the loss of permafrost. Is this in fact irreversible process, and does it go hand in hand with the melting of the ice and the warming of the Arctic? or is this something that has occurred before in our history, or in Earth's, as long as we can see? Thank you.
Yes, the answer is yes, actually, to both. It is irreversible, certainly on any human timescales. I mean, obviously, you can end up creating new permafrost once the existing permafrost thaws, but that takes tens of thousands of years. And one of the important aspects also of permafrost thaw is that once it thaws, it starts emitting carbon, and those emissions continue for about 150 to 200 years. So it's also irreversible in terms of the emissions. In other words, it thaws perhaps even in a heat wave, and then that piece of permafrost will continue emitting carbon as either methane or CO2, depending under the conditions, for up to a couple of centuries. So when we allow temperatures to peak, then we're actually having to commit future generations to negative emissions to offset those from permafrost, depending on how much of it we allow to thaw. And permafrost researchers have indeed seen that this has happened in the ancient past. And one of the reasons that we know that there is an association between loss of sea ice and loss of permafrost is because in the geologic record, we've been able to see, and some of this is very new research that came out in the past year, that at times when Arctic sea ice disappeared completely, there was massive permafrost thaw in the geologic past as well. Thanks for the question.
You're muted.
Thank you, Pam, for your explanation. Very interesting. There are many questions popping up. I can see that James Campbell, our friend in PAIM, is asking a question to me or Árni. Given the leadership role of Iceland in addressing the global climate crisis, is there effort underway to ban HFO in Icelandic waters? Well, I can give a short answer to this. I'm not familiar with any ban, but there are procedures. There is a project going on now, a very well-meant project that our Minister of Transport and the Minister of the Environment are working on, and the Icelandic Transport Authority also, which is all about using rapeseed oil for the fishing vessel fleet. And this is a very ambitious project. And some would say, how can you grow rapeseed in Iceland? Yes, we can. And there is now work going on to establish fields, and there is a working group working on this. And so in order to change the maps that we saw in the slideshow depicting Iceland as a heavy fuel oil or a heavy emitter of black carbon, this could be reversed dramatically if we could use rapeseed oil on our fishing vessels. Thank you.
I can just add that Iceland, or this government, agreed in 2017 to aim for a ban on black carbon, or rather the burning of heavy fuel oil, but then found out that they could only do so within the 12-mile territorial limit, and did it in the way that they limited sulfur amount in oil, but there are still some waivers and exemptions for ships if they use some technology such as scrubbers and for older ship. I think Iceland needs to, and the argument was that Iceland can only do this within the 12 miles. In order to ban HFO within the 200-mile limit, Iceland needs to get the IMO to agree to such a ban, and therefore, I think one precondition for that is that all the Arctic states, including US, Canada, Russia, and the Nordic countries, will together in the IMO propose a ban on HFOs. That's the precondition, I think.
Thank you, Árni. There are indeed questions here about technology that will mitigate black carbon emissions, such as, and another question on scrubbers. Is anybody in a position to answer this any further? I see Brian raising his hand. Thank you, Brian.
Sure, thanks. So the International Council on Clean Transportation has hosted a series of 6 annual workshops on black carbon emissions. And one thing that we've looked at several times are the technologies that are available to reduce black carbon emissions. The workshop participants are from industry, IMO delegations, government institutions, researchers, nonprofits. And we found that switching from heavy fuel oil, residual fuels, because they have higher aromatic contents, when you switch to the distillate fuels, which have lower aromatic contents, that you get a black carbon emissions reduction benefit. And then also, if you can then use diesel particulate filters or electrostatic precipitators, that you get an additional 90% plus reduction in black carbon emissions. So from a technology point of view, we already know how to reduce black carbon emissions in an effective way. What we don't have right now are any requirements, any regulations that require this to happen. And so it doesn't happen. On scrubbers, the ICCT did a consulting report for Environment and Climate Change Canada, and we estimated black carbon emissions from ships with scrubbers compared to using marine gas oil. And we found that even with the scrubber system, which has the range of black carbon emissions reduction potential is from basically 0% to 30%, maybe a little bit higher based on our black carbon workshops. We were finding in the literature that on average, it's about a 10% reduction in black carbon emissions. But because the ship is using heavy fuel oil, which has much higher black carbon emissions as the baseline compared to marine gas oil, using HFO with a scrubber still emits 80% more black carbon emissions than if you just used marine gas oil. This is even before a diesel particulate filter, for instance. So scrubbers aren't a good solution for the black carbon problem compared to just using distillate fuels. And also they create an ocean acidification and an ocean pollution problem. On Thursday, the ICCT is releasing a global estimate of a global estimate of scrubber pollution discharges. And you'll be able to see where ships are discharging scrubber wash water. But it includes places where there's already impacts from climate change, ocean acidification, and warming. Not much going on in the Arctic yet, but it's not a great place for discharging scrubber wash water, which is more acidic than the surrounding seawater, contributes to ocean acidification, and also has been shown to be toxic to the zooplankton that make up the base of the marine food web in a study that was published a couple of weeks ago by the Swedish Environmental Institute, IVL. There was one other question on the black carbon emission factors. These are the same that are used in the 4th IMO greenhouse gas study. They were developed by my team at the ICCT, and they're based off of the black carbon measurements from marine engines that were submitted to the IMO's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee. They reflect that newer engines and 2-stroke engines have lower black carbon emissions than older engines and 4-stroke engines. But in the Arctic, 72% of the heavy fuel oil use is by 4-stroke engines, which have the highest black carbon emissions, and that's all reflected in those estimates that I showed. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. There's a question by Mauricio Latapi about the emission control areas, ECAs, and whether those are plausible for the Arctic. Kåre?
I can try to give a reply.
Okay, thank you,
inside the INCAs, you can use scrubber systems instead of distillate. And as Brian just pointed out, the scrubber systems are not very efficient in reducing black carbon compared to the shift to distillate. So they would have a positive effect, but a HFO ban would be much more positive. Another possibility is, of course, to make an INCA with a scrubber ban, but the best thing would be completely to ban HFO directly. But there are many other good things about INCA, for example, NOx reductions. So one thing does not rule out the other. And Brian can add, maybe.
Yeah, there's some discussion about expanding emission control areas. For instance, the North American emission control area intentionally stops at the boundary of the Arctic, because when the US and Canada were putting together their application to IMO to designate it, they were finding it hard to make the case that the potential health benefits of the INCA in the Arctic, and compared to the ship traffic at the time, this was in preparing this starting in 2008, was low. And so it was hard to make the justification to extend the boundaries to the Arctic. In my view, that was a mistake. There are communities that live up there that are not enjoying the same protections as the people that live outside of the Arctic and south of them. But in some discussions about how to make an Arctic emission control area, or how countries in and near the Arctic can establish their own emission control areas, one option would be to not allow the use of scrubbers as a compliance option for emission control areas. And whether or not that could be done throughout the entire 200 nautical miles, or if it would be within 12 nautical miles of shore, would be something subject to debate, I think. But that is one option, is to avoid the negative impacts of scrubbers. They could, the requirement could be that you have to use INCA compliant fuel and not the scrubbers, which only target sulfur oxides. It doesn't target anything beyond that.
Thank you, Brian. There is one question about LNG from Lucy Hine. LNG as a marine fuel does it offer any reduction of black carbon emissions? To Pam and Brian, perhaps?
Pam, maybe I can start and you can finish on the impacts of methane in the Arctic. So using LNG results in very low black carbon emissions, but the IMO and regulators in general have a bad habit of regulating pollutants rather than pollution. And if we take a holistic view of using LNG as a marine fuel, research from the ICCT and other groups has shown that the climate benefits of using LNG as a marine fuel usually are not achieved, because the most popular marine engines that are in use today are the 4-stroke low pressure engines that are tuned to emit low amounts of nitrogen oxides, because NOx is a regulated pollutant, but as a consequence emit high amounts of unburned methane that we call methane slip. And so the overall climate impact, if you look at it on carbon dioxide equivalent basis, is that ships using LNG tend to emit more carbon dioxide equivalent emissions than ships using conventional fuels, including marine gas oil, which is the distillate fuel that that is being discussed about as being required to be used in the Arctic.
Thanks. I think that Brian really covered it fairly well. The only thing I would add is that increasing studies, I would say, of lifetime impacts, life cycle impacts of natural gas because of leakage also in production do show that it is marginally better, for example, in the power sector than coal. The one place where this is a very active debate tends to be in small scale use of natural gas, such as for cook stoves, where you do see a decrease in health impacts and black carbon. But if you're talking purely climate, then although yes, you may have lower emissions of black carbon, you will, as Brian said, have higher emissions of both fugitive methane emissions and CO2. And so for that reason, it probably doesn't make sense even as a transition fuel.
Sverrir, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, our time is up and we must conclude our discussion on this vitally important issue. I'm sorry that there have been a number of questions that we haven't addressed, but we will endeavor to follow up and respond to those in due course, if that is acceptable to those who didn't receive answer to their questions. But the hour is nearly up, so today's presentations and the discussions have highlighted the urgent need for action to address international shipping role in positive change for the Arctic region. The Arctic does not have another decade to wait for action to reduce black carbon emissions from any sources. If we are to be on the right side of the global climate issue, action is needed now. As was presented by Brian before, the 2024 ban on black carbon in the Arctic does not include Icelandic waters since they are outside the polar code elimination line. To do something about that, as I said earlier, Iceland has tried to come up with new solutions, such as burning rapeseed oil for the operation of fishing vessels, which indeed is an ongoing Icelandic project. This project is aimed at cultivating rapeseed fields in Iceland and manufacturing rapeseed oil, which will hopefully in the near future provide all Icelandic fishing vessels with fuel from this renewable source of energy. This is very ambitious, as I said earlier, but everything starts with good intentions and high expectations and ambitions. And remember that this green fuel, the rapeseed oil, does not emit black carbon when burned. Please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but this is what I've this is what I think, at least. I, for one, have faith in the innovative and solution-based solutions of the young generation, and we just wait. We will get some good solutions to save our planet. The webinar has been recorded and will be available to view. The details will be circulated later to all of you. May I once again thank our panelists today, Pam, Kåre, Brian, and Árni, and also thank you to you all, the participants. I would especially like to thank Sian, Árni, and Sylvette for all the preparations and support to make this to me as a moderator. I know that there are more people behind the scenes, thanks to them all. I have followed this remarkable forum, the Clean Arctic Alliance, on the internet and on Facebook, and I am amazed by the dedication and hard work on your part to confront the Arctic climate crisis in a meaningful and proactive way. Closer to home is the Icelandic Nature Conservation Association, with the familiar face of our Árni Finnsson, who has for years appeared on TV in Iceland with his messages of conservation and respect for nature. Thank you all for your devotedness and this important mission of hope for all of us on Earth.
And I would like to end by saying thank you, Sverrir, for guiding us through this meeting. And thank you all for attending. And at the very end, say there is an interesting meeting taking place in Reykjavik, 19 to 20 May, on the future of the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye all.
Goodbye.